As the 1980s evolved into the 1990s, the U.S. domestic scene started exiting the malaise era and back into an era where cars were once again somewhat sporty and, let's say, a bit more fun to drive. Top among those vehicles from the Pontiac lineup was the Bonneville SSEi, introduced for the 1992 model year. Pontiac had previously introduced an SSE model on its 1988 Bonnevilles, just 1 year after that vehicle was introduced in 1987. And Pontiac wanted to further capitalize on the success of that vehicle with this new model, and they added the I because this particular Bonneville had a supercharged engine under hood. Let's talk a little bit more about this very special Bonneville that was introduced for the 1992 model year. One thing to note is that although the Bonneville was redesigned for the 1992 model year to look completely different than the rather formal and architecturally styled vehicle that it replaced, it did share many components with that previous generation Bonneville that was introduced in 1987. More specifically, not only did the previous generation Bonneville and this generation share floor pans, which would have been pretty typical during this time period, they also shared much of the same inner sheet metal between generations. Take the doors, for instance. While the exterior of the doors on the 1992 model had a quite curvaceous exterior form, the inner sheet metal for the doors was the exact same between the models. This was also true of the front fenders. Pontiac wasn't the only one who employed this styling trickery, if you will, to the exterior surfacing of their vehicles. The same can be said of the Park Avenue as well as the Oldsmobile 88, making this generation of full-size General Motors vehicles one of the most successful from a financial standpoint, as so much of the inner metal was reused across generations, and yet no one would know that from the outside of the vehicles. And with respect to the exterior, the Bonneville SSEi had a number of unique and distinguishing features versus the standard trim Bonneville SE. Most prominent among these features was the cladding on the side that featured more ribs, in particular 3 specific ribs on the SSEi versus just 2 ribs on the Bonneville SE. And up front, the fog lamps were placed more closely together on the SSEi in the middle of the front fascia versus at the outer ends under the headlamps on the base Bonneville SE. SSEis also came with 3-spoke wheels, something that Pontiac would later make into a more broad divisional theme, and smoke tail lamp lenses, 2 things that weren't on the base Bonneville SE. Turning now to the interior, there were a number of distinguishing features of the Bonneville SSEi that were either standard or optional equipment. And chief among those that perhaps one would notice when entering the interior were the seats designed by Lear Siegler in terms of their functionality, and they could be operated in up to 18 different ways. So not just moving the seat backward, forward, tilting the back or the front of the seat up or down, or reclining the backrest. There are also adjustments for various lumbar supports and even an adjustment to squeeze the side bolsters more tightly against your body or more loosely. And these seats were really in keeping with the theme of General Motors at the time on excellent seating. There were a number of GM vehicles that had, let's call it, super functional seats, i.e., you could move the seats in 12 plus directions or with 12 plus adjustments, including the Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special and the Buick Electra Park Avenue, among others, including the Bonneville SSEi. Also interesting for the SSEi was the dash, which for 1 year only would have this faux wood trim that kind of carried over from the previous generation. Pontiac would get rid of that faux wood grain trim for the 1993 model year, but the overall dash layout would stay the same, and it contained a number of interesting items. It's not surprising that the car has a typical round speedometer in the middle of the instrument cluster and an RPM gauge to the left of that or a fuel gauge to the right of it. But drivers did also get full instrumentation, including a temperature gauge, oil pressure gauge, and even a boost gauge, something that was certainly foreign to Pontiac buyers. And there were other interesting features as well, one of which was the driver information center that could alert drivers to a lamp being out or the engine oil needing to be changed, and also included a trip odometer within its functionality. Off to the left of the instrument cluster was a compass, and this is a humorously bad compass, I would say, in terms of General Motors vehicles. It had kind of these multiple sticks that would tell you what direction in which you were traveling, or maybe not even what direction you were traveling, but where east or south or north or west were. It's kind of a strange setup, and at least on the vehicles that I've driven, seemed like it always needed to be recalibrated, which meant you had to go to some parking lot and drive around in a circle multiple times to redo that. And off to the right, there was the automatic climate control setup that wasn't necessarily new for the Pontiac buyer. This is something that had been in Bonneville's all the way back to the 1965 model year, when automatic climate control was introduced as an option after Cadillac had it as a one-year exclusive in 1964. I do think there's one other interesting feature of this dash, and that is the Glovebox door. You can see here the air vents are incorporated into it, and when you open the Glovebox, the air vents go with it. So there's actually a seal on the backside of that air vent because the ducting comes through the backside of the glove box to exit out those vents. I can't recall many cars that I've seen with that before or since, so I thought that I would call that specifically out. And next to the shifter, you could get optional features including variable damping on the ride control, where you could select what type of a ride you wanted, and also traction control. The Bonneville SSEi also featured an optional heads-up display in some years. This was a novel technology for GM. Wasn't first introduced on the Bonneville SSEi, but something that gave buyers a feature to talk about with their friends and provided functionality. A number of cars still have this to this day in the General Motors stable, including the current Corvette. And I must say I saved the best for last, and that is what came under hood in the Bonneville SSEi. I previously mentioned that it was a supercharged engine. It was a supercharged 3800 series V6 that made 205 horsepower in the 1992 model year and 260 pound-feet of torque. The engine would remain at this power level until the 1994 model year, when a new Generation 3 Eaton M62 supercharger would be introduced, along with OBD 1.5 capabilities, meaning mostly OBD1 functionality with an OBD2 connector and a few extra functions. This raised the horsepower under hood to 225 and torque up to 275 foot-pounds. In 1995, though, the base Bonnevilles would get upgraded to the 3800 Series 2 engine, and the base engine would be upgraded to 205 horsepower and 230 pound-feet of torque. It took until 1996 for the SSEi to get the 3800 Series 2 Supercharged V6, making 240 horsepower and 280 foot-pounds of torque. And this would be the highest horsepower in this particular generation Bonneville that would end in 1999. Later Bonnevilles would get even higher horsepower engines, including a 275 horsepower Northstar V8 for the 2004 model year. So overall, the Bonneville for the 1992 model year and continuing all the way through the 1999 model year was just a particularly sleek and still timeless looking vehicle of the 1990s. The car still looks good today, at least in my opinion, and it's one of those that I think is destined to be a modern collectible simply because it looks good and also because the powertrain under hood is quite reliable, robust, and frankly, it's fun to drive. I could say, having driven a number of these SSEIs, that they do feel quite peppy. The early 1992 model years would take about 8.5 seconds to go 0 to 60, and by the time the car got the 3800 Series 2 V6, it was about a 7-second flat, 7.2 second 0 to 60 car. So still pretty peppy even by modern standards. And one thing that you certainly can't get in modern vehicles are these seats. You're lucky to get 6-way power seats, maybe 8-way, including the backrest if you're lucky on most modern cars. But Pontiac was really charting new ground here with the Bonneville SSEi, and something that it had started, actually. Those seats began with the previous generation's 1998 SSE. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this feature of the Bonneville SSEi. And I featured the Bonneville SSEi. I could have featured the SSE, which had a number of the same features, but who wants that when you can get the supercharged version of the vehicle instead? Hope you enjoyed this special on the Bonneville SSEi. Until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.